Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, welcome to our webinar today. We're very happy to have you with us. We have an exciting event ahead of us, so I'm glad that you've joined us. My name is Sarah Bunin Benor, and I am a professor at Hebrew Union College and director of the HUC Jewish Language Project, which does research and education about Jewish languages around the world. And we had this idea for this panel when I met Leo Cooper at a genealogy conference, and he was telling me about the amazing work he's doing at the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation. And I said, wow, there's so much to talk about in relation to genetics and language and names. And I said, let's do this event where we can bring an expert on language and names, Alexander Beider, to this conversation. And then we brought in Jeremy Kotlyar as well. And that's what we're doing today. So I want to first thank my co-sponsors. So in addition to the Jewish Language Project, this event is co-sponsored by the American Sephardi Federation, Anu Museum of the Jewish People, HUC Connect, the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, Jewish Gen, Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, Northeastern University's Jewish Migration Project, Jewish Unity Through Diversity, which now has a new name, Jewish Tapestry, Yiddish Book Center, SAMI, Sephardi American Mizrahi Initiative, and the Sephardic Mizrahi Q Network. And just to introduce our panelists, Alexander Beider, also known as Sasha, is an independent scholar and author of many books on Jewish languages and names. Jeremy Kotlyar is a co-director of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation. Leo Cooper is co-president of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation and an associate at Reich Lab at Harvard University and director at Open Genomes and an incoming student at the Hebrew Union College Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to have an initial presentation by Alexander Beider, and he is going to answer what Jewish historical questions he's trying to answer using linguistic and onomastic data. And then we will get a response from Jeremy Kotlyar focusing on names, and then from Leo Cooper, focusing on language. And they're going to talk about how Beider's approach relates to their genetic research and what is the interplay between genetics and linguistics and onomastics in Jewish historical research. Take it away, Sasha.
Thank you. Uh, I will share my screen. Hello. So I have 20 minutes to present the what is a main element of my life during the last 40 years. uh, so uh, for the topic of today, what is really important for me or for all my studies, the notion of ethnocultural population group. In my studies, I'm studying only Jewish groups, but of course, what I will present in many aspects is valid for non-Jews as well. So what I call ethnocultural population group, it's a group that that has, according to some criteria, the same value. So it's auto-determining itself as the same group. So typically Jewish, for example, or a Jewish religion. It's living on the compact territory. It's using the same vernacular language. And we are speaking about something that occurs during specific time period. So if we compare different groups between them that lived during different time periods, this is the main aspect actually of my study. And this notion of ethnocultural group is a dynamic notion. So if we change from, there is a change from one group to another group, cultural change, what can be the main reasons for that? Uh, the, uh, there are three groups of reasons. So the first two are local, so without changing of territories, it can be due to internal innovations in the language, in the names, in other cultural elements. It can be also due to external influences, borrowing or other kinds of external influence. And of course, there can be a change of territory. And in this case, we speak about migration. For various Jewish group, how I proceeded continue to proceed in my studies on Jewish names in different regions and my study on Yiddish dialects. So the first step is I start always to learn from historical studies and from historical documents which are published what is known as factual elements. So what are the settlement details that appears in historical studies, in historical documents? What are the references that we can find about migration? What was the legal situation of Jews in the area? Because this is often important to understand some elements of the cultural cultural aspects and also why there was a migration, and of course relationship with Gentile majority, so Christian or Muslim. And once this step is done, I compile a comprehensive, excuse me for error, a corpus of onomastic and linguistic elements that can be considered as diagnostic of migration. Because in the total number of names, in the total corpus of names, with total number of words, rules, grammatical rules, for example, there are some that can be considered to be diagnostic of migration and other where of interest, of course, to such some historical or just purely linguistic onomastic questions like what was the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, where Jews lived, etc. But for migration specifically, there are some elements that can be used for determining the migrations and other which are not useful for that. And once this collection of elements, diagnostic of migration, is done for different Jewish groups, so in different periods or different territories during the same period, what I'm doing a comparative analysis of these elements to see. With comparative analysis allows to understand that some groups living during the same period, they have the same ancestors, or some groups which are living during different periods, one of them can be an ancestor of another one. So to illustrate with purely theoretical points, I will present some examples. So if we consider modern time, so just the half of this 20th century, of course, we have such Jewish ethno-cultural group like Moroccan Jews, Turkish Jews, or Ashkenazi Jews from Soviet Union, or North America, or South African. So this is, of course, well documented, perfectly known. All of these groups correspond to all criteria that I announced it at the beginning. So one territory, we are living in the same period, and they auto-determine themselves as, for example, Turkish Jews. If we go to the past, so for example, 18th and 19th centuries, of course, my list is not exhaustive. I'm just giving examples for some period. So if we consider 18th and 19th centuries, so here I presented some other groups, and you see that they're not really the same. We had I distinguish Maghrebi Jews, so that covers Moroccan inside of it, Western and Eastern Sephardic, New Romaniote, what I call New Romaniote, so Greek speaking Jews that are following the specific Romaniote rite, Levantine Jews, Ashkenazic Jews. And if we look into the Middle Ages, we find other groups. And so, for example, and for every period, to see the links between different groups, it's worth to use different granularity. So you see here, for example, in the Middle Ages, for making analysis about links between different groups that existed in the Middle Ages and that appeared during the next century, for me, it's important to distinguish Eastern Maghreb. It's Eastern Maghreb from Western Maghreb. So Eastern Maghreb is Tunisia, Constantine area of Algeria, and Tripolitania part of Libya, and Western Maghreb is Morocco and Oran area of Algeria. Iberian, so Jews who lived in the Iberian Peninsula, that are normally usually called Sephardic, and their descendants are considered to be Sephardic, etc., etc. And if we go more deeply into the past, so when we speak about antiquity, we can distinguish clearly Western Jewry that corresponded to the Western Roman Empire, Eastern that covers, for example, Babylonia, and maybe, so this is, I don't know, whether we need to introduce an additional group that correspond to those who lived continued to live in the land of Israel, who lived in Syria. But for my specific studies, so based on onomastic and linguistic data, not all these levels are relevant because I cannot go deeply than Middle Ages. So the passage from Middle Ages to antiquity cannot be done using a linguistic or onomastic method, just because we don't have information about there is between antiquity and Middle Ages, there are dark ages during which there was an enormous cultural shift for Jewry in different countries. And so there was change of almost total change of the corpus of given names. Surnames were not used before Middle Ages, and languages also changed totally between antiquity and Middle Ages. So before Middle Ages, this period and the link between groups of Jews who lived in the Middle Ages and in the antiquity, to my mind, cannot be done using linguistic and onomastic method. So I'm concentrated in all my studies. I'm concentrated is to study what are the links between Jewish group who lived in the Middle Ages and later, not before. And so from this, of course, links between last century and the contemporary Jewry is quite obvious. So of course, everybody knows that Ashkenazic Jews gave rise to the bulk of North American Jewry, to Soviet Ashkenazic Jews of South Africa. And also we can, so the main focus of my study is not here, it is really here. So between Middle Ages to the modern times, what are the links? So if, for example, we have Greek-speaking groups that use in the Jewish rite, which is called Romaniot, so Greek-oriented, and all group, are this group really related? Of course, they're related, but the relationship is not linear because all Romaniot they contributed according to my to the results of my study. They contribute not only to New Romaniot from Ioannina area in Greece, but also to Eastern Sephardim in Istanbul and other areas, etc. So this is the main focus and main objective to establish the links of this kind. And of course, for every link, the granularity can be different. For example, here it's just a scheme that provides just very general ideas, but actually, if we consider, I will take just one example, South African Jewry that existed during until recently. And of course, it was Ashkenazic, but if we say just Ashkenazic, it's not sufficient because if we study in depth, we will see that not only they were just Ashkenazic, they were from Eastern Europe. And if we can continue studying, we will see that not just Eastern Europe, it's Lithuania. And if we continue to study Lithuania, we will see it's just the western part of Lithuania. So for link, for example, this one, we can establish, because this is quite recent, we can easily establish using onomastic or just historical data that not all Ashkenazim, but very small part of this contributed to that. For a few words about given names, surnames, and linguistics. So in all cases, it is a similar kind of approach. So we have for a specific Jewish group a current corpus here of given names. And so what is needed to obtain information about migration? We need to distinguish three layers in this current corpus. We need to distinguish what are the names that appeared locally, so when inception took place in this place. What are the names that were borrowed from, also without any change of territories? Some were borrowed from other non-Jewish population group, but other could be borrowed from Jewish religious texts, of course, without any movement. And the only layer which is really important for studying migration is what are the names that were not borrowed, that were not innovated, but they were inherited from other group that lived in the same or different territory. So for that, there are some methods that allow to distinguish between these three ways, with these three layers of the current corpus. And when I wrote my book about Jewish Ashkenazic given names from the Middle Ages until modern times, this is a map that I did after this purely onomastic study based on given names, and so taking into account names which are diagnostic for migration. And so this is, you see here, centuries of migration in different parts of Europe based on the analysis of given names, almost exclusively given names. If we speak about surnames, the scheme is very similar. Of course, we are not taking names from Jewish text, but otherwise it is the same scheme. Some names appeared locally, some were borrowed from other population group, and again, the only group which is important for migration analysis is the names that were inherited from migrants, that were brought by migrants. And so if for Ashkenazim, so my first studies for Eastern Europe, this analysis of surnames allows just to establish links inside of Eastern Europe, inside of Pale of Settlement to Poland or Galicia. It is because surnames appeared starting from the end of the 18th century only. So we cannot go deep with studying and Ashkenazic surnames from Eastern Europe. But if we consider Sephardic surnames, we can go as deeper as with the given names of Ashkenazim, because surnames existed already for Sephardim since since the Middle Ages. And so looking how the same names that can consider as diagnostic, so not Cohen, not Levi, of course, but names which are which betray their origin, we can establish links between different groups of Jews who lived in different territories, different periods. And so you see here one table from my forthcoming book about Ottoman territories is from the one of the chapter in which I provided a table saying what is the origin of migration, what is the destination of migration, and during what period it took place. And this is based on the analysis of surnames mainly. Last topic, so languages. So this scheme is very similar to what I presented for given names and surnames, but there is something which is additional and for which there is no equivalent for when we study names. It is, of course, may have elements, words or grammatical rules that are inherited from ancestors, but there are two kinds of ancestry in the language. So, for example, if I take here Yiddish, like current language of Yiddish Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe for modern time, then the parent language is German. And the parent language is German, so it is not German spoke by Jews, but it is German spoken by non-Jews. So here the language is, some elements are inherited in Yiddish from, not from Jews, but from Germans. And some of these elements, since German dialects, since in German, German is not just a homogeneous language, it's always has been a group of dialects. And so if we identify in some element of Yiddish to what dialect of German it corresponds, it shows the migration route. And another element which is extremely important for identifying migration is languages which are not from the same part of the language tree. So for Yiddish, it would be languages French, Old Czech. So it's not a language from which Yiddish is derived. But some elements in Yiddish betray their origin, that the everyday language of some a large group of ancestors was not German, but Old French or Old Czech. And so these elements, once they identified, they also help to identify what are the where the ancestors lived. And so my last slide is here. It's a scheme from my book about the origin of Yiddish dialects, and that shows the three groups which are originally in the Middle Ages were independent. So East Canaan is modern West Belarus and West and Ukraine. West Canaan would correspond to Czech Republic and areas around it, like one part of East Germany, one part of Austria, and Ashkenaz, properly speaking, so Rhineland and Franconia. And so these are the three components from which all what we call today Ashkenazic Jews were formed. And of these three sources, which one was marginal according to my analysis of the history of Yiddish, and this one were both important. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sasha. That was very informative. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We will get to those later, but first we turn to Jeremy for a response.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you, Dr. Beider, for that presentation. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, is this visible to everyone?
No.
No. Okay, let me try one more time. Oh, there we go. How about now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Jeremy Kotlyar. I am one of the directors of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation. And today I want to speak a little bit about how onomastics and genetics can complement each other in understanding the origins of Ashkenazi Jews. So first, just a little bit about what we know about the historical origins of modern Ashkenazi Jews. So the first Jews in Central Europe appear roughly around the 10th century of the Common Era. We start to see references to Jews in medieval times, and specifically in two distinct communities, in two distinct geographic locations. So if we look at the map here, we have Ashkenaz, which roughly corresponds to medieval Western Germany, and also what on this map is labeled Little Canaan, but on Dr. Beider's maps was labeled West Canaan. So Central Europe, roughly around the area of the modern Czech Republic. And then into the late medieval period, there is a synthesis between these communities. We see this through linguistic data, onomastic data, also genetic data. There was not too long ago a paper by Shamam Waldman et al. This is a genetics paper, which my colleague Leo also worked on. And it showed that modern Ashkenazim, to some extent, are a synthesis of these two communities. Now, historically, scholars have used a number of historical indicators, including cultural features, nusach, so the prayers that Jews were using, language, and to a lesser extent, documented migration, to try to come up with hypotheses about the origins of these medieval Jews in Central Europe. And as you can see from this map, which I took from an atlas in 1992, there are some arrows coming from France and from Italy into Central Europe. So those were some of the primary hypotheses historically that Ashkenazi may have originated from France and or Italy. And what I want to look at is how do onomastics and genetics agree with this picture or complicate it? Okay, so what are the main questions of interest that I want to explore? Firstly, what are the historical sources, both of Ashkenazi given names and genetic lineages, before they appeared in Central Europe? And also, how might the genetic information that I will present today either complicate the picture that onomastics gives us or complement this picture? And why should onomastics and genetics be linked at all? That might be a question that some people are asking. And I want to present the answer using a very simple schematic. If we were to propose that there is some early nascent Ashkenazi community in medieval times, and that various early founders were coming into this community from other locations, in theory, they should have carried with them both a name or a set of family names and also their genetic lineage. So these two factors should be correlated to some extent in the founding of the medieval Ashkenazi community. So what do I mean by genetic lineages? That's something we should clarify right away. So there's a few different ways of looking at genetic data. Many of you might have heard of this before, but for those who haven't, there's autosomal DNA, which is the DNA that we inherit half from each parent, a quarter from each grandparent, etc. But there's also uniparentals, which is DNA that we inherit specifically on one familial line. So there's Y DNA. This is what men are inheriting from their fathers, etc. And there's also mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited through the mother's line in the same fashion. Now, for today, I want to focus primarily on Y DNA, and that's because it has a particular genetic advantage. And that's that Y DNA mutates at a relatively predictable rate. And because of that, when we take two men, we can, with relative accuracy, estimate when their common ancestor lived on the paternal line. So when I'm speaking about Ashkenazi genetic lineages today, I'm going to be talking about Y DNA primarily. So first, let's discuss a bit about Ashkenazi names. A lot of the material regarding Ashkenazi names that I will show you is related to Dr. Beider's book, Dictionary of Ashkenazi Given Names. So if anyone is interested in this subject, I would recommend looking into this book. And specifically, what I want to discuss, just introducing Ashkenazi names, is that we can distinguish these names into several etymological categories. Also, I want to mention that because medieval Ashkenazim essentially existed in two different groups, classical Ashkenaz in Western Germany and Canaan in Central Europe, each of these medieval Jewish groups, as you might expect, had a different corpus of given names. To some extent, that corpus might have overlapped, but there might be certain names that medieval Ashkenaz used that Canaan did not, and vice versa. So regarding etymological categories, what I want to present to you is just this idea that Ashkenazi given names can come from different etymological sources. So for example, there is a Semitic linguistic origin. Now some of these names, like I give an example, Moshe, this is a name that comes right from the Bible, it's biblical Hebrew, but that's not all that Semitic names are. It's not only biblical Hebrew names. There could be other names. For example, Chia, this is an Aramaic name. So there are languages other than Hebrew that could also contribute to the corpus of Ashkenazi names. Or, for example, a name like Malka. This is a Hebrew name, but it's not a name found in the Bible. It's a name created from a Hebrew word in the post-biblical period. Now, in addition to that, we also have Greek names, Romance names in the Ashkenazi corpus. In some areas of medieval Ashkenaz, around 20% of women used Romance names. So this was a very significant category in reality. Names like Bela came from the Romance languages into the Ashkenazi given name corpus. And in addition to Greek and Romance names, we also have Germanic and Slavic names. However, for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be focusing more on the first three categories because Germanic and Slavic names were created by Ashkenazim and Canaanim locally in Central Europe, whereas these other three categories, for the most part, may have been inherited from ancestors who migrated from elsewhere. So, First, I'd like to talk about the Ashkenazi connection to Tzarfat. So what is Tzarfat? This is the Jewish name primarily referring to the area of northern and central France, as well as England, as you can see on this map, the medieval Jewish communities living there. And I would argue that a significant proportion of medieval Ashkenazi given names likely originated in an older historical period from the Jewish communities of France. So I divide these names into a few categories. Some of these are very, very likely to be Tsarfati names. Some examples include Bon Ami, Bonifant. These are names that have a French etymological origin. But as you may notice, these names are not used among Ashkenazim today. So some Ashkenazim bore those names, but they were not common enough necessarily to survive into modern times. On the other hand, we have a category of names which I designate as complex Romance names. These are names like Bela, Yenta, Buna, which likely did originate from Tsarfatim. Now, in the case of Bela, for example, medieval Ashkenazim also used a form known as Belet. Now, you may recognize the suffix et from names like Jeanette, for example. This is a suffix that originates from the French language. So it's very likely that these kinds of names, which are quite common Ashkenazi names, that they did originate from Tsarfatim. But on the other hand, we have to mention the factor that Jews in other Romance-speaking countries like Spain or Italy may also have used these names. So how can we prove, for example, that every Bela in medieval Ashkenaz came from France or her ancestors came from France and not necessarily from Italy? So it becomes a little bit complicated. Also, there are a few Semitic names that may be diagnostic. There are a few relatively obscure names. For example, Oshaya. This is a Talmudic form that is known specifically in Ashkenaz and medieval Tzarfat. But of course, the caveat with Semitic names is that theoretically any Jewish community could have used Semitic names, and it's difficult to prove that these names must have come from Tzarfat, even if it's likely. So the question I would like to pose is, can the genetic information that we glean from Y-DNA complement this picture of likely Tsarfati origins, or is it going to throw some cold water on this picture? So I want to bring two examples of Y-DNA lineages. So here we have a lineage where an Ashkenazi branch originating in the 14th century converges with a British family around the year 1100. Now, interestingly, this British family has a surname that indicates origins, converted origins, that this is a family which descends from converts from Judaism to Christianity. And as I mentioned previously, the Jews of medieval England were Tsarfati Jews in their origin. So it's quite likely that this individual who lived around the year 1100, who's the common ancestor of this British family and this Ashkenazi branch, likely that ancestor was a Tsarfati Jew. Also, I'd like to bring up this lineage. Here we can see four distinct Ashkenazi branches converging around the year 800 CE. This is a relatively common Ashkenazi lineage. Fun fact, this is actually Albert Einstein's paternal lineage. And we can see that along with these four Ashkenazi branches, there is also this individual highlighted in red called Chapelfield. Now, this is actually an ancient DNA sample, or more precisely from medieval times, and this was a Jewish individual from medieval Norwich who was killed in the famous Norwich massacre, an anti-Semitic massacre, and now this individual's DNA was taken, and we know that he belongs to this Y-DNA lineage. So this, again, because this individual was a Tsarfati Jew living in England, this is another example of an Ashkenazi lineage which appears to have older Tsarfati roots, going back around to the year 800. Now, another case that we can bring up is the case of Italy. So a few medieval Ashkenazi names may also have originated from the Jewish communities of Italy, though this is a little bit more difficult to prove, because as you'll see, there are far fewer specifically Italian names in the Ashkenazi given name corpus. Now, one example that there is the name Bonaventura. This appears to be a real Italian name that was used by Ashkenazim, but it did not survive into modern times. However, there are a number of Semitic names which are relatively unusual, such as Shabtai, God, Azriel, etc., which do not seem to have been popular among Western European Jewry, but were used among medieval Italian Jewry and were also known for the most part among the medieval community of Canaan. And because of that, these names survive into Ashkenazim to this day. However, again, because these are names with a Semitic origin, it may be a little bit difficult to say conclusively that they all must represent Italian Jewish migrants. So the question again I would like to pose is, how can Y-DNA complement this picture? Now we have a lineage here where you see an Italian Jewish individual converging with an Ashkenazi branch around the 4th century CE. So here is a case of an Ashkenazi lineage which likely originates in the older Jewish communities of Italy. And in fact, this lineage shares an ancestor with a Mizrahi Jewish lineage going back to 1100 BCE. So this may be an ancient Israelite lineage, in fact. Additionally, we have this lineage where we have two Ashkenazi branches which share an ancestor around 600 CE with this third branch. And you can see there's an individual from the United Kingdom, but his paternal origin actually goes back to a Jewish community in the region of March in central Italy. So this is another lineage which likely comes to Ashkenazim from medieval Italian Jews or pre-medieval Italian Jews. Now, the last thing I want to discuss today, not to take up too much time, is the possibility of an onomastic corridor from Sepharad to Ashkenaz. Now, Sepharad is the term that we use for the medieval Jews of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Now, there are relatively few medieval Ashkenazi given names that are likely to have a direct Sephardi origin. However, what's interesting is that a number of Ashkenazi given names seem to be broadly shared across the Jewish communities of Western Europe, meaning that they exist among Ashkenazim, Jews in France, and also Jews in Spain going down to Morocco. Now, there are a few names, as I mentioned, which seem to directly originate from Spain. Names like Hakim, for example, were used among medieval Ashkenazim, and this is an Arabic name, so it's difficult to see where else it could have originated from, other than the Arabic-speaking Jews of Spain. But on the other hand, there are a number of Ashkenazi names like Fivish or Schneier that were used very commonly in Spain, and were also used commonly in France, and then became Ashkenazi names. So it's a little bit difficult for us to understand just from the onomastic perspective whether this is more a result of convergence, adopting similar names, or whether there might be a real ancestral root here. So what I would like to propose is that genetics can tell us that there is some real ancestral connection between the medieval Sephardi and medieval Ashkenazi Jewish community. For example, we have this lineage, which is a sub-branch of the major Kohenic, shared among Kohanim, Y-DNA lineage, CB01, which was characterized by the co-president of the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, Josh Lipson, who spoke last week, and his co-authors in this preprint that he recently publicized. And here we have four branches that converge around the year 600 CE. And one of these is an Ashkenazi branch. Two of these are Sephardi branches. And one actually contains a common ancestor between a Moroccan Jew and Ashkenazi Jews who lived around 800 CE. So these are the centuries immediately preceding the founding of the medieval Ashkenazi Jewish community, where we have ancestral connections to Sephardi Jews just a couple of centuries prior. So the question I would like to pose is, these onomastic findings of shared given names across Western European Jewry, is that largely coincidental, or maybe the genetic evidence is complementing that to say that there is a common ancestral root among Western European Jewry as a whole in the centuries preceding medieval times. Now, I'm going to conclude here, and I'm just going to skip a few slides for the sake of time. But what I want to bring up is that the majority of Ashkenazi Jewish Y-DNA lineages are not like what I showed in the sense that we don't actually have recent connections to them, which is why we need to test a lot more Jewish individuals to really find these kinds of connections and to complement the onomastic and historical evidence regarding the origins of Ashkenazi Jews. So, and that also goes to non-Ashkenazi Jews as well. Even less information is available regarding non-Ashkenazi Jews. And that's where the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation really comes in. And our goal is to use genetic tools to learn more about these Jewish lineages and how they connect across communities. And if you are interested in genetic testing, maybe yourself or a family member, or if you are interested in helping to subsidize these sorts of genetic tests, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so I would encourage you to please visit our website, jewishgeneticdiscovery.org. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jeremy. So much. I have so many questions. But first, we're going to turn to Leo, and maybe he will answer some of those, and then we will open it up for everyone's questions. Leo.
All right, just give me one moment. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. And thank you, Jeremy and Sasha, for your wonderful presentations. I'm going to do a short presentation today, zooming in on the population that both Jeremy and Sasha mentioned, the Jewish community of medieval Central and Eastern Europe, which we term today the West Canaanites, and how names, languages, and genetics reveal something that traditional history alone really struggled with. So again, if you are not very familiar with West Canaanites, it is not a commonly known term, and it is certainly not the term that this community would have identified themselves by, but it is a modern scholarly term innovated by Sasha Beider in his book, adapting from earlier scholars. And I re-show a map here that Sasha showed in his presentation to allow us to imagine the geographic area in which this community inhabited in the medieval period, about in Central Europe. So I'd like to read off an excerpt of a recent historical article which posed important questions on the emergence of medieval Jewish diaspora communities in Europe. So I'm going to recite this here. In Germany, Jewish life for a long time was a small-scale affair, wholly dependent on immigration. In the 9th century, Jewish migrants to Germany cannot have made up more than a few dozen families. In the 10th century, they may have numbered a few hundred. In the course of the 11th century, there was a marked growth in the number of Jews, nourished not only by internal demographic growth, but by ongoing immigration from France, and to a lesser degree from Italy. It appears that converts from Christianity, though present, contributed only a handful of individuals to this early Jewish population. Over the next 200 years, the pace of settlement quickened. By the early 14th century, the number of locations and the geographic scope of Jewish presence had attained a peak that remained unmatched until the 19th century. From the beginning of Jewish settlement to 1348, around 1,000 Jewish communities were established in different regions that comprised the medieval German Empire. This excerpt, written by Michael Talk in his 2018 article, characterizes the story of the Western communities, the community of Jews that is related to what we've been calling Sarfat and Ashkenaz. Here is what he said in that same article about the communities of Eastern Europe. So, in Eastern Europe, the sizable Roman-era Jewish settlement along the shores of the Danube and the Black Sea did not continue into the early medieval period. The earliest evidence for renewed presence in the 10th and 11th centuries suggests that it was transient, made up of traders coming mostly from Western Germany and less frequently from the East, the lands of the Turks. These merchants crossed Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland on their way to and from Russia, and some remained active in their lands of origin. A stable community, possibly of Khazar origin, apparently settled in Kiev in the 10th century. In the 11th century, Jews inhabited a few communities in Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland. Outside of these, further settlement did not occur before the 12th and 13th centuries. Eastern Europe was thus populated by Jews considerably later, and at a considerably lower density than all other regions of Europe. The sources tell us little about a possible pre-Ashkenazi stratum, whether Byzantine, Turkish Khazar, or Slavonic. In the 14th century, Jews moved more deeply into Slavonic regions from long-settled Bohemia. This was also the case for Jews from Silesia and Pomerania, who had migrated eastwards from Germany during the 13th century. The two sentences I highlighted here, I chose to highlight because I hope they ring alarm bells in your ears. If you were listening closely to Jeremy and Sasha's presentations, these claims are contrary to the claims that they were making, that the community of Jews in this area was independent from that of Western Germany, and that it is a stratum of modern Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry that can be distinguished from that of Western Germany. And I believe that the conflict here in scholarship is in part due to Michael Tock's framing. So as an economic historian, Tock is interested most in certain kinds of records, such as tax documents and legal charters. Additionally, this historian employs a distinctly conservative and skeptical approach to his historical sources. And the result is a framework that will inevitably miss subtle details which might be important for answering questions about settlement history, migration, and relationships between Jewish communities. And so how do we address these concerns of mine? Well, I hold that we should compare and contrast aspects of Jewish diaspora groups' cultural traditions, of which there is a wide variety. And these cultural traditions include patterns in and between given names and spoken languages. It's important to understand that this other information is not meant to replace a conservative historical approach based around skepticism, but rather to update it with new and different information. So I include here a couple examples of diagnostic variables coming from religious language and dialect, spoken language, between these two communities that helps us to know that they were in fact different. So in Jewish religious rite, there were differences among Jewish communities, historical Jewish communities, in how certain letters were pronounced. In some communities, a letter like het was pronounced just with the normal H sound, normal in English, so ha. Meanwhile, in other communities, it had that throaty H, the ch sound. B'nai Hess refers to the communities of Western Germany, and the B'nai Ches refers to the West Canaanites, which is the community I'm focusing on. Other letters differed in their pronunciation as well, not just in the pronunciation too, but also in the name of the letter. So, for those who went through Jewish religious education, you may have called this letter, which is meant to sign the t sound, tz sound, or ts. You may have learned to pronounce it, to call that letter by different names, maybe a tzaddik or a tzadi. And we understand today that these two forms found in Ashkenazi Jews actually were not always, balanced. There, one community on one side of Europe had one of these names. Meanwhile, the other community had another name, and that modern Ashkenazi inherited both names for the same letter. Meanwhile, an important variable in spoken language, which I think has in other languages too, we can see this is relevant to old history and ancestry, is names for family members and ancestors. And the two names I'm looking at here are grandfather and grandmother. So in Western Yiddish, that is to say, the language of modern Jews who came from Germany, these names for these ancestors have a German root. Meanwhile, in Eastern Ashkenazi Jews, the names for these same ancestors have a root in the medieval Czech language. And this difference helps to show that it's not just their nusach or their Jewish religious rite that was different, but also their dialect as well. So what's impressive to me is that this model that onomastics and language can pick up on, but traditional history can struggle to find, was reproduced using ancient DNA. So for those who aren't aware, we have ancient DNA, that is to say, medieval DNA from a community in Central Europe, Erfurt in Germany. And this 14th century cemetery contained individuals with genetic differences. And I characterize some of these differences on the table on the left. The community that I link with West Canaanites had more Slavic related ancestry than the individuals I link to the Western community. Uh, Additionally, I saw a question about this in the chat about genetic diseases and how they might fit in here. It did not fit into the context of, or it didn't fit into the manuscript itself, but I noticed that the members of the group we connect with descendants from the Western German Jewish community, they were the carriers of AJ-associated genetic diseases in our ancient set. Meanwhile, the West Canaanite Jews in the set were not carriers of AJ-specific genetic diseases. And we have other genetic evidences to that line up with this model based on names and languages. I also want to mention that both groups have a unique signature in their stable isotope ratios. So when you grow up, any living thing will eat food probably from the local area. And the exact chemical signatures of certain stable isotopes will remain in teeth of that individual as long as they live. And it will be a record of their of what they were eating when their adult teeth were forming, is the idea. And what we found here, this is not a genetic signal, it's a biological signal. But what we found is that these two groups also grew up in different areas. So it's not just that they were genetically different, but we also have a unique biological signal that there was also migration at play. So where does that leave us? I hold that we must adopt an abundance mindset, that it is a great thing that we have a bunch of different kind of data and that all of it matters all of the time. Additionally, it's important to be humble as we approach this work. We are attempting to reconstruct the past, not to project models of what we feel is or isn't likely onto our sources. Finally, it's multidisciplinary research that successfully balances multiple forms of evidence that will be what solves enduring historical mysteries. Thank you, and let's get to the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Leo. Wow. So, a lot to talk about. I want to start with a few questions from me, and then we'll give a chance to Sasha to respond to what you just heard. Actually, let's just start with that. Sasha, what's your response? What questions came up for you based on these presentations or specific data that you wanted to address that was mentioned?
Well, I have nothing to say because both of them, Jeremy and Leo, made a very good synthesis of what I presented in the corresponding books about Yiddish and about given names. And I'm very happy that something that I suggested theoretically, for example, for Erfurt, it was really a funny story because when there was a study about Erfurt, it was not published yet, but it was already prepared to be published. I was contacted by Leo, who said, "Do you know that the genetic analysis confirmed what you predicted in your book?" And so he sent me this article. I looked, and I was not, to be honest, I was not able to understand anything because for me it was too technical. I'm a linguist and not geneticist. But Leo was very passionate to explain me to it really confirms what I predicted. So I was very happy, but it was not easy for me. So what I think is really important that this group of young men from this genetic association, they study when I would not be able to understand what people from write in the articles about genetics. People from genetics, we are not able to understand what I'm writing about linguistics, and they were not even aware about my name, of course. But thanks to this young man who knew both, so we understand the genetics terminology, and they also read my studies. So thanks to them, there was a possibility to bring the two together, and so the authors of this genetic study asked me to write the historical section for this article. So at the last moment of before the publication of Erfurt. So this is why as I said, I'm very happy that there are people who can help to realize something that for me, exactly as Leo presented in the last slide, should be if we advance using one tool, for example, onomastic or linguistic, another tool which is historical, and third tool, genetic, and if all three show this similar results and they are in line, this is the only possibility to advance our knowledge and avoid making theories which are purely speculative.
Yeah, and so are there any attempts to actually map the genetic and linguistic and onomastic data on one big map with many data points and ultimately come up with a better historical picture?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So this is what they try to do, I think, now. So I, of course, will continue just to using the tools that I understand as a linguist, is a specialist in onomastic. But I think that hopefully in a few years, when there will be more results on the genetic part, there will be possibility not just to deal with specific lineages, but to make some statistical maybe analysis of different results. Because until now, it's difficult to make a big conclusion based on some lineages. And the more will be the bigger will be the number of people tested, and the better will be our genetic knowledge. The better will be basis for drawing some theoretical conclusion being based on statistical approach on this genetic, because of course we can always find one Ashkenazi Jew who has the same origin as someone in maybe Australia or Australian aborigine, but this could be just a one specific case. So what is really important to understand trends is statistical analysis of genetic data. And this is for a near future, I hope.
Yeah, Leo, do you want to say something about the projects in the works to do that mapping on a large scale?
Sure. I completely agree that the next steps involve trying to find ways to combine large sample sizes of these different kinds of data together in the context of the um, landscape of the Earth and the passage through time. Absolutely. For to the our foundations, and we're trying to increase the sample size of non-Ashkenazi Jews for these kind of comparisons. And I believe there is a lot of work to be done to develop methods that can handle these different forms of evidence and align them at the same time to produce these kind of like summary statistics, perhaps in a Bayesian kind of way. Um, but I believe that work is still a bit out, and we still right now need to focus on increasing our sample size, not just of genetic sequences of modern Jewish communities, especially representing Jewish communities that are going extinct or kinds of Jewish ancestry that's going extinct today. That's very important, but also to extend the work that Dr. Beider is doing and to develop these large databases of names and linguistic information, for example, dialect words, which I'm sure your project is working hard on. These kind of large databases are what we'll be looking to combine our genetic evidence with once our sample sizes are large enough to allow for this kind of statistical analysis.
Yeah, Jeremy, your presentation included a lot of specific individuals with their genetic line. First, I wanted to know, how did you match the genetic data to specific names?
Mm.
Like,
So
especially with Einstein.
So with Einstein, so we use family tree DNA a lot. All of the images which I showed you of these genetic lineages are from family tree DNA. And with Einstein, for example, you have some patrilineal relatives of his, people who share the same paternal line, who were able to do a DNA test, and then it was determined, for example, that Einstein's paternal lineage would be in the Y-DNA which I showed. There's also many examples of this with rabbinical lines, famous rabbinical families like Katznellenbogen family, the Spoler Zeta. A lot of work has been done on these sorts of families. One thing I would just add to what Leo was saying and also to what you were saying, Sarah, is the lineages which I showed are somewhat exceptional in a sense because they do have close connections of Ashkenazim and only several centuries prior to other individuals. But that's not entirely representative of the broader set of Ashkenazi lineages. There are many, many Y-DNA lineages which do not have these sorts of connections. For example, Leo's own Y-DNA lineage, I believe it's the second largest in Ashkenazim. Over 7% of Ashkenazim carry this lineage. But in the last 5,000 years or so, there are no connections to this Ashkenazi branch. So it's difficult to make any sort of conclusion about the recent pre-Ashkenazi origin of such an important lineage. The same thing can be said, for example, for the most common Ashkenazi lineage, which some people may have heard of. This is the Levitical lineage called R-Y2619. It's known for having a large portion of Ashkenazi Levites who have a Levitical tradition. And there are no connections to this lineage from medieval times to around 3,200 years ago. So the only way we really resolve this question is by testing more individuals, especially from non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities, to find these sorts of connections. And that's really the work which our foundation is trying to do, because Ashkenazi Jews are very well tested. At this point, we have a good understanding of what sorts of lineages are present in the Ashkenazi population. But when it comes to Moroccan Jews or Persian Jews or Yemenite Jews, we're really falling behind in this sense. But hopefully, over the next several years, our foundation will be able to do important work in bringing the representation from those communities up to the necessary level.
That's great. And I want to bring in a quote related to that from one of Sasha's articles. It's in a book edited by Hanks et al. In 2022. The quote is about Tunis. It says, in the city of Tunis, about one-third of names were brought from Livorno, which is in Italy, right? Italy.
Yes.
Mainly by families of the Portuguese origin during the 17th and 18th centuries, and Italian Jews of various origin during the 19th century and first half of the 20th century. Something like that. When you read something like that, Jeremy and Leo, do you then go to your genetic data and say, what can our genetic data tell us about this idea? Like, how can we map that onto the genetic data?
Absolutely. And I think that is one uh, reason why we do focus on the Y chromosome in our data. So, for example, if we can imagine a scenario where a medieval Iberian Jew in the, let's say, I think it's like 1497, is forced to move to Portugal and then has a paternal line that continues and let's say a grandson or a great grandson or something like that of his moves to Livorno in Italy, and then generations pass, and then that paternal line is still present. And then that paternal line migrates like a now like a great 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 grandson migrates from Livorno to Tunis and is a member of the Grana community there. So, what would we find if we tested this individual's like full genome? You know, we might find traces of those other Italian Jewish ancestors, which his ancestors encountered in Italy. We would find traces of other ancestors they encountered in Portugal. We may even encounter, evidences of Jewish families that the family mixed with in Tunis itself, right? But by looking at the Y chromosome only, we might be able to find other Sephardic Jewish descendants, whether they are Jewish or not today, and we would be able to, date the approximately the most recent common ancestor of this Grana individual, hypothetical, and their closest Sephardic Jewish relatives. And so that's just an example of how I would approach that kind of connection.
Yeah, and so that also relates to one of the questions in the Q&A, and I encourage the audience to put more questions into the Q&A. We have a few that are there now, and I'm sure you have others in mind. So do you use DNA samples that from the tests that have already been taken? Or would you require new DNA tests to be taken? And so I think it seems like you're using DNA evidence from multiple historical periods, including ones that are available on various ancestry services websites, and also ones that are available when you do archaeological evidence, like in Erfurt and in the well, and et cetera. But then also, can DNA from non-Jews enhance your analyses?
Yes,
Absolutely.
so the best way if you have a pre-existing genetic test to support our work is if that test is done through the Family Tree DNA company. Uh, you may join our project, the Jewish Genetic Discovery Project on Family Tree DNA for absolutely free, and it will join our database, and we'll be able to see your results and incorporate it into our base of knowledge. Um, and In terms of the archaeological sites, certainly those are our crown jewels. We learn so much from those. We learn things that we can't learn from modern people. Uh, do you mind reminding me on that follow-up of that
About non-Jews,
second?
the use of
Yes, thank
data from
you.
non-Jews.
Certainly, as all human populations, like the sample sizes for all human populations increase, we learn more and more about Jewish ancestry as well. That's one of my favorite parts about having a global perspective, a global interest on Jewish heritage, as Jewish communities from around the world also connect with human populations from around the world. And so as those populations become better tested, it inevitably helps us understand more about what's specific to certain Jewish communities, but also historical instances of conversions or joining of Jewish groups from non-Jewish individuals.
Yeah. I would just
Okay.
add to
Oh,
that,
Jeremy. Yeah.
sorry, people may be interested to know that in a couple of the lineages which I presented, which in branches which have a Sephardi Jewish origin, there are individuals today who have Latino heritage, and likely they had a Jewish ancestor who converted to Catholicism at some point and then arrived in the New World, and also a number of individuals of Fassi heritage. These are the Moroccan Muslim inhabitants of the city of Fez in Morocco, who are known to carry a large proportion of Jewish ancestry. So, absolutely, we're always finding connections between Jewish and non-Jewish populations in that sense.
Okay. And someone is asking about whether other DNA testing sites can join your project, like Ancestry, MyHeritage, etc.
We don't have an easy way right now for those kind of kits to join our ongoing work. The truth is that oftentimes, uh, I mean, I would estimate that the number of Ashkenazi Jews who have taken the 23andMe or Ancestry DNA test is on the order of tens of thousands of individuals, perhaps even more. And the truth is that those results barely differ, and because of this sampling, saturation, we don't get much more information from seeing a new result like that. Though again, we're seeking, especially representatives of Jewish communities that are that are not well represented in our genetic databases. And so if you have tested before at a different company and you are not Ashkenazi Jewish, that might be of interest to us and I encourage anyone who has questions or think that they might help to this end to reach out to us. We have a contact form on our website. I'm also going to put in the chat now the link to our family tree DNA project. This is the easiest way to join our work if you have an account on Family Tree DNA. I will briefly say that Family Tree DNA offers for a low cost transfers from other DNA companies.
Mm.
And so you can upload a different DNA kit to Family Tree DNA and then join our project in that way.
And we will send out a link in our follow-up email about where you can do that.
Sounds great.
So also there's a few questions about various historical groups, and here's one for Jeremy. Well, attempting to fill in the blanks in the Ashkenazi origin story, which region would be the most helpful to have ancient or medieval DNA results from?
Thank you for that question. That's a very good question. Um, so it seems based on some of the evidence we have, both from the onomastic perspective, so some of the given names which I mentioned in the talk, and also from the genetic perspective, some of the Y-DNA lineages, that a substantial portion of the ancestors of these Jews, both in medieval Ashkenaz and medieval Canaan, originated in what's today France and Italy. So if I had to identify two regions where I would want ancient Jewish DNA from, we use ancient as a technical term. Really, this would be early medieval or late antiquity Jewish DNA. I would say from France and from Italy for Ashkenazi Jews and understanding the origins of Ashkenazi Jews specifically. When it comes to other Jewish communities, there are many other regions, of course, which we could speak about.
Great. Here's another question. It's about France. So, how much documented migration was there in the Middle Ages between Jewish communities in southern France and northern France? Would there have been any significant genetic differences between the members of these two communities? What might DNA studies like Châteauroux or others reveal to us about these two communities?
Um, that's an important question. So there being bordered regions, and I would love to hear if Sasha has any input specifically, but being bordering regions, of course, we may assume that there were connections between these Jewish communities, and certainly if there were Jewish remains that were sequenced from a place like Châteauroux, where there was an archaeological work done on a medieval Jewish cemetery, that would certainly reveal insights to that end. I will say one. I will say briefly one thing that's in my mind that because of events in the later medieval and early modern periods, uh, specifically the expulsion of Jews from France, we have very few families today which retain ancestry from this specific area. And while some southern French Jews migrated to Iberia and to northern Italy, or possibly even stayed in southern France, like in Avignon, while there are these uh, streams of continuity from this area, these families today number very few. And so these kind of connections I might call, jewels or diamonds, like that we are really searching for, families from these really obscure, today, obscure Jewish communities, which might reveal connections that expand on the origins of Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Italian Jews, everyone in these Western European diasporas.
Um,
Sasha, yeah.
Yeah. So concerning the exact question about do we have a real proofs about the migration from southern France to northern France? No, we don't have historical data about that. And even worse, for example, for Châteauroux, that is in central France, and if we look map of the maps of medieval France with all Jewish community knows, we can conjecture that this people from this community belonged to Tsarfat, so to northern France. But even if we speak about this, we do not have any historical evidence about the presence of just one Jew in Châteauroux. So it's not even about migration. We don't have even historical evidence about the present. It was really unexpected that there was a possibility to find a cemetery and there was a possibility to prove that these people are really Jewish, but historically there were no documents. And so what I could observe myself is that for a few given names, actually the names that one of them was quoted by Jeremy Schneier, so senior, initially senior, and there was another bandit. I can explain their presence in. Well, definitely, they came to their island not from southern France. They came from northern France, but to explain their presence in northern France, I cannot explain it without conjecturing their migration from southern France. So there are few given names whose analysis implies that there were such migration, but no historical data. And so for genetics, it is, I think, the only case now for France, and it is situated in the area which is in central France without historical data. So this is a very good example of where onomastic, and here especially genetics of people who are from old cemeteries can be really helpful because historical documents are mute.
Hmm. Okay, well, and our last presentation brought together a historian with Leo and also Josh from the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation to talk about how genetic data can be used in history. And I think this conversation shows that it's really helpful to bring in also some onomastic and linguistic evidence. Onomastics is the study of names, and linguistics is the study of language. And I think one other comment that's coming in is about unlock codes, and I assume that's for genetic data, for uploading genetic data. So that's great. And then also, I just want to wrap up by thanking our panelists who've done a great job. There are a lot of comments in the chat thanking us for this great conversation and pointing out how young and smart Jeremy and Leo are, and also how smart Sasha is. I am so grateful that you guys joined this conversation. I want to thank our co-sponsors again, and I want to also point out that the Jewish Language Project is starting a new program of study tours where we are going to particular locations and learning about the Jewish community there, past and present, with a focus on Jewish languages, names, culture, music, food, and that kind of thing. And our first one is going to be this late spring, in late May, early June in Warsaw, in Poland. We'll go to Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow. And I encourage you to follow up with the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation, to read all of Sasha's books, although that will take a lifetime because there are many, and also to join our email list at the Jewish Language Project and follow us on social media. And we can make events available like this to the public for free thanks to the generous donations of the people who attend. So we encourage you all to make a donation, both to the Jewish Language Project and to the Jewish Genetic Discovery Foundation. Thank you all for coming.